Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the State Water Survey. Today's our webinar on Well Care 101, what you need to know to protect your family. The State Water Survey is at the U of I. We're one of the state scientific surveys. You're probably more familiar in your state with your state geological survey or your state natural history survey. Illinois is one of only 2 states with a water survey, and we've been around for a long time. Trying to protect water and help people understand things like their wells. We're funded by the Rural Community Assistance Partnership and US EPA to provide the private well class. As usual, I guess, if you haven't signed up for the 10 lesson class, it's delivered through email, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But this is meant to supplement those things. It's not the actual class itself. Okay. As far as CEs or continuing education credit, we're a provider for NEHA, the National Environmental Health Association. I want to remind everyone that you can't get credit for the same class or the same webinar, which this was last done in April of 24, more than once per credentialing cycle, which is 2 years. So if your credentialing cycle just started this month and you participate in the webinar today, you can't get credit for the same webinar again until after 11/1/26. We're also an LEHP provider for Illinois. We'd like to be able to do that in more states, but we just don't have the bandwidth. But what we have today, we have an agenda, the NEHA forms, and a webinar worksheet under the handouts tab. And if you are interested in getting credit for this, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. We do record all these webinars, and we often have folks contact us saying, hey, I watched the webinar on YouTube and wanting credit for it. You cannot get credit for watching the YouTube video. You need to be here with all of us. All right. And yeah, this just shows the other dates that this webinar has been offered within the last 2 years. Yes, I forgot to take off 10/5/22 because it's been more than 2 years. Okay, one other thing regarding continuing education credit. We had kind of a disconnect internally where we were requiring 90% of your time for to get a certificate and credit, but we've been giving partial credit. So if someone was here only an hour, they could get an hour's credit. We're no longer offering that. We really expect everyone to be here for the entire webinar. So for example, sometimes I talk too long, sometimes I don't talk long enough. If it's our fault or my fault and the webinar only goes an hour and 45 minutes, you'll still get your 2-hour certificate as long as you're there the entire hour and 45 minutes. If it does go long, which they do sometimes, you just have to be there for the 2 hours. But we obviously would prefer that folks hang around, listen to the questions at the end, find out what's on well owners' minds, and participate until it's over. So, because again, the point is to learn more about well issues, and especially as a professional, if you're an environmental health professional or a driller or whatever, you'll learn things that might help you with the folks you're there to help or that contact you and ask for help. All right, thank you. And I'd be glad to address that if there's any questions. So today's webinar, again, is part of our national program funded through RCAP to support private well owners. It does follow the private well class lessons. There's 10 lessons, but this is not that class. Again, we are recording this. It will be on YouTube, as are all the past ones. And I'll mention several times probably today that some of the value, and like the last time this webinar was offered was in April. The advantage is the questions we're answering today from the questions you all asked in advance are different from the ones that we answered in April. So if you go back and look at both of those videos and just go to the hour and 20-minute point or whatever, where we start answering questions, you'll find different questions and answers on those videos compared to the first part of this, which is the same material. So they are worthwhile is the point there. So who is RCAP? RCAP's a Rural Community Assistance Partnership. They're a nonprofit with a national office in DC and 6 regional partners that are nonprofits that support regions. So for instance, we're in Illinois. Great Lakes Community Action Partnership is based in Ohio, but there are at least 5 RCAP staff that are in Illinois and among all the other states. They're technical assistance providers and trainers. Most of them are licensed water or wastewater operators, and they work with small communities all over the country. They also have private well experts who maintain a program, boots on the ground. It's really unique in that they can work with a professional to set up a workshop, provide you speakers, co-organize with you if you really want to be active in your local area, and promote well stewardship. We can get you the contact information for those folks. And we also developed an assessment tool, which is to do a one-on-one well assessment of somebody's private well, to look at, everything about that situation. Every well is different, or every situation is different. You may have copper pipes or lead pipes versus PVC pipes or PEX in your home. Somebody may have a standard well cap, and someone might have a Folgers can on top of their well. There's always something different almost about every situation, and going through all of the steps of that assessment, which is completely free and available to anyone who requests it, is something worthwhile as a well owner to go through. The folks from RCAP in all the regions are experts. They know a lot about private wells, and they'll be able to answer a lot of questions that are specific to your situation that I can't do without being there or seeing your well and your situation. So if you want to get a hold of one of those folks, you can email us. We'll give you that several times, or you can, and we can give you the contact, or we can give them your contact. And depending on what state you're in, you can see which group has staff that would be able to help you. Okay. So I mentioned the site assessments. They've done over 3,800 of these around the country, all for a private well owner. Most requested, or some are requested by a local or state health agency when there's a problem well, and they may either don't have the expertise or don't have the time to deal with that. They may call the RCAP region and say, hey, could you go out and take a look at this well for us? And it's a completely free service. It's funded through US EPA, and the idea is to help educate and help educate well owners and provide knowledge about their situation on how they could improve either the safety of their well or their drinking water, or you may be doing everything just right, and you'll get that too. But it's a way to have someone who has some wherewithal to identify any just vulnerabilities you might have that might lead to poor outcomes for your drinking water. And again, with that, they're developing partnerships with state, county, and local health departments, extension, you name it. So they would be glad to work with folks on putting together workshops that might be beneficial to a well owner, those sorts of things. That's, again, if you want to get a hold of any of those folks, you can contact us, and we will get them your information. So we're from the State Water Survey, which I mentioned at the beginning. We've been around since 1895. We're at the University of Illinois. This is a placard near Noyes Lab, which is where the Water Survey started over 100 years ago. 129 years right now, which is pretty cool. Early on, we did a lot of work looking at like typhoid and cholera and basic water quality of rivers and communities. And today, we do a lot more. We help communities determine where they can get more water. We do groundwater modeling to determine how a new well might affect pumpage, or how that pumpage might impact other wells. We house the state's well records. So a homeowner or someone who's buying property and wants to build a house in a rural area can call us, and we can tell them what to expect, geology and water quality, because of the amount of data we've collected over the last 100 years. So it's, and we also do applied research on a lot of cool topics that are relevant to well owners and also public water supplies. So it's really a neat place to work. We get to do a lot of things, a lot of service, like this program is a real benefit that the science we have behind us and the folks we have here that are geologists and engineers can really help whenever we get questions that are a little more complicated or have a specific bent. We also have a lot of old records, and I like to show these every time. So this was from showing typhoid fever by years in Quincy, Illinois. They put in a filter plant in 1891, and it reduced those things. And as we learned more about water treatment and water chemistry, eventually we eradicated that. But there's a lot of these studies that were done in the early parts of the Water Survey's history. This is another one that was in Rockford. I love this slide. These are all old glass plate slides, and so the inset picture with the broken glass is almost it's a 2.5 by 3 inch slide, and we were able to scan that, and even though it's broken, it tells a story about a lot of times dairy milk was you went and got milk from someplace, an ice cream parlor or someplace where they distributed milk. You could go there and there'd be a large tank. Everyone used the same bucket, and so there's some cases where the milk has actually been the cause of the typhoid. And so they were investigating whether Mr. Erickson's dairy route might have contributed or would help them identify the source. And you can see there were 112 cases total, only 8 of them here were from his route. But it's an interesting research study that was going on, well over 100 years ago. A lot of water quality testing, these were common in Illinois until the 30s. You see the little tin cup there in the background on the edge of the platform, and the water surveys, the guy's 2 briefcases, he's collecting samples there. These hand pumps were outlawed eventually in public places just because they grow bacteria. That tin cup, people are drinking from it without any sanitation whatsoever. And so again, this tells some of the history of where we come in water treatment and some of those things. And if you've seen a modern drill rig, it looks much different than this. All those big belts are pulling pulleys from basically a railroad engine. It's off to the right in this picture, but that's the way wells were drilled back in the 20s. So getting to today, Steve Wilson, I'm a groundwater hydrologist. Katie Buckley has helped out with a webinar. She's the person you'll contact if you want to get CEs. She manages our info@privatewellclass.org email address. And if you do have questions that come up today as we're going through the webinar, you can ask them in the chat or the question box on your GoToWebinar window. And from there, we will make a list, and at the very end, we'll go back through those. So again, we'll stay as long as you stay, and we'll answer your questions if we can. And we also have 2 of our private well staff who manage our Help Center hotline, Sally Dolan and Aaron Huggett, on today, which they're free to pipe in during the questions if anything comes up. Okay, so if you're a well owner, the things to remember are that wells aren't regulated. Once they're installed and they're in place, you buy a home with a well. No one's going to test it for you. No one's going to make sure that it's safe or tell you have to add treatment. That's on you. You're basically the water operator of a very small water system. And so it's up to you to understand what that means, why it's important, and to actually follow through and protect the health of your family. So the things to remember are that a lot of people judge water by how it looks. That can have no bearing. Contaminants are colorless, odorless, tasteless in some cases. Arsenic's a great example. You can't see it, taste it, or smell it, but it can be very high in some of our groundwaters, and so that's why you have to test. I grew up on an old dug well that was totally contaminated my whole life growing up, but now I live on city water in the community water supply, and I pay $60 to $80 a month, and that's the cost for a public water supply to treat the water, have a licensed water operator, collect samples as required by the Safe Drinking Water Act every 3 months, and push all that water out to everybody's home so that when I turn on my tap in the morning in my kitchen sink, it just comes out and I don't have to worry about it. For you as a well owner, that's all your responsibility. So I do want to mention that we've done this for a long time. The water survey's been around a long time, and so have I. We find that the two biggest reasons when people have well or water quality problems are either poor well construction, a well that isn't safe, especially near the surface and can let surface water in, and lack of knowledge from a homeowner. Just not having an understanding of all that can happen with a well, why it's important, which is one of the reasons why when some homeowners we've talked to who maybe have really no idea, they've lived in the city their whole life, they bought a house in the country, if they have an opportunity to hook up to a public water supply, we always recommend they do, just because somebody else is making sure that's always safe for you. Okay. As far as well considerations, depth and these are the things that are probably the most important to look at. Well depth and source, as well as well type. And people always ask, what's a shallow well? What's a deep well? It really depends on where you're at and how the well's constructed. So you could have, this is a picture, an image of a bedrock well, and how bedrock wells are constructed is you only put casing, the well casing, down 10 to 20 feet into the rock, typically. So that rock might be at 40 feet, it might be at 20 feet, it might be at 200 feet, and that's very different because if there's only casing 20 feet below the top of the rock, then if it's close to the surface, it's much more likely that other things from the surface can get in the well. And knowing the source of your water means which aquifer does it come from? Is it a sand and gravel aquifer that's at the surface? Is it a buried sand and gravel like we have in Champaign where there's clay over top of it kind of protecting it and it doesn't start till over 100 feet below land surface? That's much more safe because water has to trickle through, in the case in Champaign County where I live, it has to trickle through 100 feet or more of till and clay and sand all mixed up from glacial deposition. And so understanding that is really important. And then for a lot of older wells that may not be up to code and might actually be at risk because they don't have a proper well cap or they're large diameter and they don't have a proper seal, then your location on the landscape matters for things like, is there potential for flooding? Or is it likely that if there's a downpour that the well could be overtopped, even if it's just running past down to get to a lower elevation? Or can water pond near the well? All those things matter. And getting down to groundwater flow direction, that's sometimes very difficult to know. I know I do have a slide later in the questions that kind of shows that, where someone's buried some 55-gallon drums and it shows where the water's flowing towards a home. And so if you're interested in that, there may be data we have for certain parts of the state and some of the larger aquifers in Illinois. I know our office has done a lot of work looking at those aquifers, and we have maps of the water level surface as far as the pressure surface, so we know the direction water is flowing. It's usually flowing from a high area to a low area. So for instance, the other reason that matters is the shallow water table, which isn't necessarily the aquifer your water is coming from, is going to follow the land surface. So the best example of that, if you have a small subdivision, say it's 20 homes, and there's a lake on one end, and all the homes go uphill from there along one street, houses on both sides. Well, the person on the opposite end is at the highest elevation. There's probably a water table, and the water, which is a saturated part of the overburden, like it shows on this diagram, but it's not the aquifer. The saturated overburden could be clay, so it doesn't produce enough water for a well, but it's still saturated. And so water is going to move downhill. The water table is going to slowly move through that clay and eventually discharge down by the lake. If all of those homes have septic systems and all of the wells are shallow, large diameter wells because there is no aquifer, and they're using the saturated overburden for their water supply, then except for the house at the very top of the hill, everyone else is susceptible to that septic leachate getting into that water table and potentially contaminating the well that's down gradient from it. And water's flowing in a certain direction, and that's why that's important, and we mention it here. Also, the area surrounding your well. We see a lot of crazy things. Besides wells in basements or in a garage or under a porch, we also see livestock in the feedlot. I've certainly seen wells that are in the feedlot with cattle standing right around them. And it's an old dug well that it's likely all its water is coming from near the surface. So don't tie your dog to your wellhead. We've seen that, all kinds of different things. Your wells near a barn or garage, are you storing chemicals there? All those things matter. You should keep things away from your well as much as you can. So as far as correcting poor construction, the situation is this. There's a lot of wells in existence before the late 70s, early 80s, whenever these things started to become more of a concern, and most states passed laws requiring drillers to file logs to get a permit, and they put out your well has to be so far from some of these potential sources of contamination. As the well codes have gotten better in most states, there's actually 2 that still don't have well construction code. None of the older wells are required to actually replace or improve their old well to make it meet the new code. So we have a majority of wells out there that don't meet current well construction code in any given state. And the problem is, because they're grandfathered in, we still see, even at least in Illinois, we see wells in pits, which is basically a big pit with the well down the bottom of it. And that's because, like in Illinois and northern climates, we have freezing in the winter, we have a frost line or where the ground is frozen, and wells were put in pits so that the pump could pump water out of the well out the top and then go through a horizontal pipe into the home without worrying about being above that frost line and their pipes freezing. And today we have pitless adapters, which allow us to do that and extend the pipe up to the top of the above ground, which it should be. And then there's also many hand dug wells that are also still in use. My grandpa hand dug our well in 1933. It's only 14 foot deep, and it's in a ravine where water's running across the surface down to the well. When it rained hard, our water was cloudy. So it was always contaminated with surface influence stuff. And they're just not a safe way to get a water supply. And not only are they a contamination source, but also a safety hazard when it's a large pit or a large diameter well that's not taken care of. So as examples here, the picture on the upper left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. This home had this little well house. You can see the well is a large diameter with corrugated pipe. The woman stepped on that piece of plywood that was the cover, and it broke, and she fell in, and it killed her. But you can see there's a funnel there that's likely for oil for the pump. There's that gray stuff is likely old insulation that's fallen off, or rats have chewed, or whatever. Just not a safe well supply. Picture on the upper right is that's a dead goat, and you can see if you look down on the sides that there's stones along the side. There's an old stone well. This is in southern Illinois, and it's not in use today, but the homeowner had put a piece of concrete tile, like a tile that goes under the road, vertically in this well, and it only stuck up about 6 inches. Well, the neighbors had goats. The goat got out, and it saw that and it was curious, I guess, or fell in trying to get water. And if that were a water supply, or it's contaminating the shallow groundwater in the area, those are all problems. And you think, well, no one would drink that. Well, we've had people on this webinar say, hey, my dad said he had a funny smell or taste in his water. We went out to look, and they had a dug well, and we shined a flashlight down the bottom of it. We saw there's like 40 snakes down there. So this does happen, and it is real, and it's not beyond the scope of possibility. And so the bottom picture is a well we sampled as part of a pesticide and nitrate study back actually in the 90s to determine how susceptible these wells are. And this particular well is a great example of what not to do. It's a large diameter well. It's covered by a bunch of 2x10 pieces of wood and then some tin with concrete blocks on it. Rats, snakes, you name it, can get in there, fall in, die, deteriorate, decompose in there. But in addition, that's a farm field, that line north of that. It says this is in the winter, so you're not seeing anything there. But the actual area around the well is a pasture for cattle. That's why those posts look so rubbed and worn. It's because those are great scratching posts for cows. And so the reason all that mud is on the lower right side is because the cows are up there scratching, doing their business, and that's infiltrating into the ground right around the well. So it's a great example of what not to do and how a well should not be utilized. In this particular situation, there's a small ditch off the picture to the left and to the south, left and bottom, and it's likely that there's no water up by their home. It's all clay, and it's just, they couldn't find any water. And down here closer to this ditch, they found, maybe some, it's glacial material, so it's mostly clay, sand, and silt. They found a small layer of sand that would provide water to a dug well. And so that's what they did. In this well, we don't know how old it is, but it very well could be that old or even older as the one that I grew up on. So what should you do if you have a well like this? Try to bring it up to code. We see, for an old dug well, that's not as likely, but if it's a well in a pit, you could extend the pipe to the surface, then fill that pit in. You can also put a drilled well inside of a dug well and then fill the dug well up with clay, grout, or cement. We see that happen sometimes. It depends on the geology. You'd have to talk to a well driller. But all those things matter, and protecting your well at the wellhead will eliminate a lot of problems. We worked with a county in New York, I think it was Jefferson County, I'm trying to remember now, but they got some funding from CDC to do some sampling in their county. It wasn't Jefferson, anyway. And what they found, they looked at each wellhead, whether the screen on the there's a small hole on a well cap that's inverted, so the pressure changes and the atmospheric pressure changes don't affect the well too much. And anyway, they found that either the screens were gone on those, or their seal that held their well cap tight, airtight or watertight, was brittle or not there, or things like Folgers can were on there. And when they looked at the wells that had positive hits for coliform bacteria, it was significantly correlated to a poor wellhead. And so you can't, having a wellhead that's proper, well cap that's properly, a properly constructed, approved well cap, where the rubber seal is still intact and the bolts are all tight and all those things, is one of the best things you can do. One thing that's rarely talked about is that there's a rubber seal, so you can, with bolts holding the top part of the cap together and the bottom part is connected to the actual casing. There's a rubber seal there that, especially in a cold climate where you have different big temperature swings, that rubber seal is eventually going to get brittle and break, and that is an open area then for bugs or anything else to get in, or if it gets flooded, for water to get in. And so that's something to change every so often as well. And I talked to a well driller about how often that probably needs to be done. Same thing with abandoned wells, because it was the 60s or 70s before well logs were required in most states. There are many wells out there that we don't have on file. I know we did a study looking at the impacts of a large 18 million gallon a day well field on all the surrounding private wells in a 9 township area, almost 300 square miles. And what we learned is that I sent 5 geology students out for a summer to inventory every well in that area. They found 1,708 wells. It's a very rural area. We only had well logs for 788 of them. And so we had more wells out there that were in use than we had by far than we had logs for. So those are all undocumented. It doesn't mean they did anything wrong. The well owner, that well's probably just that old, before 1978 in Illinois. And so, but what that means is there's a lot of these old wells out there. Someone buys an old farmhouse or a farmstead, they tear down the house, they put up a new home. They may think for a while they're going to keep the old well just to water their garden and drill a new well. They eventually forget about that. You know, it becomes also a source of contamination, and it could really be a liability for you as a homeowner. If someone's on your property, whether they belong there or not, and they fall through that and they get hurt, or they get killed, or someone puts stuff down that old well, it's a good place to store things, or to get rid of things out of sight, out of mind, and you contaminate an aquifer, and so your neighbor's wells are useless too. You could be liable for all that, and it's not a cheap thing. So as an example, these are 2 more pictures from the Washington State Department of Ecology. A horse fell in an old abandoned well. Yeah. And then the one on the bottom is a gentleman who was just walking in his backyard, bought this property and had no idea there was a well back there somewhere. It had grass growing over it, but it wasn't, I'm not sure even how that happens, but it did. And he fell through 45 feet, and they pulled him out and he walked away. Very lucky, but it just goes to show that that well should have been sealed so that there's no risk of that happening. So as far as basic well care, best management practices, you know, one, if you're going to put in a well, some states allow you to drill your own well. Illinois does, but they've changed the law so that it used to be you could put in anything. So we had people going out there and digging their own wells or putting in a sand point, both of which are not safe. And now the law requires that if you're going to put in your own well, you still can, but you have to follow Illinois well construction code, and you have to file a log with the county health department and get a permit to do it. So we just recommend it's really not worth it unless you're a well driller and you have experience with a drill rig and have access to one. Your best bet is to use a licensed driller, pump installer, or contractor when you're doing anything with your well. You know, it's a huge investment. I know I have a colleague who put in a well just 2 years ago. It was $11,000, and it wasn't that deep. It's in glacial material, but it's not an investment that you want to mess with and try to fix on your own. So it can last a long time. A well, your pump, you know, we've seen cases where there's wells that are well over 100 years old, still in use, still work fine, still protective. But it's important to maintain, to take care of that properly. Every state except 2 have well construction code. This is just an example, Minnesota Department of Health, but it tells you what the driller has to do. One in every state, but those same 2, you have to be a licensed well driller in order to drill in the state, which means you have a license that you took a test and shows that you have the wherewithal. You have to keep continuing education credit up. There's 2 states who don't have all those rules, Pennsylvania and Alaska. In Pennsylvania, you can actually purchase a driller's license. All of us could today. We could go to Pennsylvania's website and purchase a $60 driller's license. But as it says on their website, this in no way means that you have any experience or have the knowledge to actually drill a well properly and to protect an aquifer and all that stuff. So, but for most states, or if you're in Pennsylvania or Alaska, you could use in other states. You can look at all the rules. You know, there's rules on everything. Minimum depth, type of material you can use, how it's installed, a lot of things that are meant to make sure that the well's safe when it's there. And a lot of states now require testing at construction. So they test for bacteria, depends on the state. Some states sample just a few of the wells that are drilled, or a portion of the wells that are drilled, new wells. And so you really, if you want to know, or if you're thinking about putting in a well, that's where you could find some of that information. And also, most states have some place that houses their well records. You know, in Illinois, it's the State Water Survey and our State Geological Survey. In Minnesota, it's the Minnesota Department of Health. In Wisconsin, it's Wisconsin DNR. So you just need to, if you Google my state water well records, you'll get to someone who can help you and answer specific questions related to the rules in your state. As far as the well site, you know, it's really about making sure your well is safe. This particular well, I need to change this picture because there's one thing wrong with it, and that is we recommend mounding the ground surface up around the well so that when there is a hard rain, water's running away from the well. This one doesn't do that, but it's a nice clean picture. It's got a nice new well cap, and you know, the extra pipe there is actually all the electric line stuff that goes to a pump that's down in the well. So the vent, again, I mentioned the vent for atmospheric pressure has a screen on it to keep things out. The casing's elevated, you know, and it should be accessible. Like I said, we see wells that are in basements, under porches. You know, if you have a problem, especially with a submersible pump, you have to have access. We had a case in one of the counties here where we were measuring a guy's well regularly for water level. He let us do that. He's very generous in that respect. We went to measure his well in the next spring, and he built a garage over his well. And so he just cut it off, poured concrete, and now his well is completely inaccessible, thinking he'll never need to do anything. Well, eventually his pump's going to fail, or he's going to have some other issue. And, you know, he's really looking at drilling a brand new well when that happens. So the last thing here is inspect for potential sources. I mentioned that already. If there's anything around the well, you don't want to have anything, even trees. You know, we had a case, one of the RCAP folks had a case where they had all this, they kept coming back with bacteria positives, and no one could figure out why, or no one was sure why. And then when they sent us a picture, there is a probably 24-inch or more bigger tree that's maybe 3 feet away from the well. And so what had happened, it was also a PVC well. And as that tree grew, you know, around where the drilling had occurred for that well, roots had gotten in there and circled that casing. And then as they grew, they squeezed it and eventually cracked it. And so it was all the bacteria and other things around that are around tree roots that were getting in this. And so, yeah, you should just not have anything near your well if you can avoid it. As an example, again, this is Minnesota. This is a really nice diagram. I've always liked it, so I use it as an example. Your well code should have something like this in it with setback distances. You know, you don't want to put your well right next to your septic tank or next to your cattle if you're on a farm. There's a whole list of things here in setback distances, and these are the minimum distances required by the state, and they'll be different in every state. And in some cases, they'll be different if your superficial geology is more vulnerable. So like if you have karst geology where there's sinkholes and caves, you know, you have a lot of surface water influence, you may have to be further away from anything that might be an influence. And honestly, in karst, it might not matter just because water's free flowing in that bedrock. And if there's contamination coming in anywhere, it's going to end up finding its way near you, I imagine. But for instance, sand, if you have sand at the surface, like in a lot of alluvial sands along major river valleys, you know, they're more likely to have water infiltrate. And so when it rains, the water, more of it's infiltrating in the ground than running off on the ground. And so if you have any sources nearby, you don't want that too close to your well. Here's the bottom half of that. I mean, there's a lot of things that can affect your well. And as far as accessibility, 10 feet from an electric line, 3 feet from a building. And again, that 3 feet is a minimum. We certainly would suggest you don't put a well or a building within 3 feet of your well, but that's there so that, you know, if you have to pull a pump, your contractor has to be able to get his truck, and it's a big flatbed to pull that pump out. He has to be able to get that over the back end, has to be able to get over the well in order to pull it. And so just get this common sense stuff that you might not think about. As far as septic systems, you know, they're certainly a risk if they're too close or the groundwater flow is toward the well. When your absorption field that are shown here, you know, they're built, you dig a big hole basically, then you line all that with sand or some porous material and or like crushed rock or gravel, and then you put these pipes in here. So when water runs out of your septic tank, it runs into this absorption field and then dissipates down into the soil and the ground. Natural bacteria will break that up. It's a great system, a natural system, as long as it's maintained. There's a lot of things you can do to mess that up. Putting the wrong, yeah, and I'll get into that in a second. But if you look at this tank, there's the inlet pipe on the left. Water comes in from your home, your toilet, your shower, your dishwasher. There's things that might float, the scum. There's things that might fall to the bottom, which is the sludge. And then in the middle, you have this clearer water that's settling stuff out so that then it can run out into your drain field or absorption field. If you don't clean this properly, it can fill up the sludge. And so there's a lot on septic systems. Sally actually did a webinar for us in July. I encourage you, if you're interested in more details about septic systems or on-site systems, that you take a look at that on our YouTube channel. But the big message is you've got to maintain this as well. This one has one riser that's up to the surface and the other one isn't, the inspection port. In the old days, when they installed these septic systems, they buried them. They didn't have either one had a riser. You had to dig it out every time. And they've gone away from that. I think now the picture, I think I have a picture of it here later. What they show as a design has both of these with risers up to the surface. And so it's important to take care of your system. If you don't, that sludge gets up and clogs the outlet. Water's going to back up, and eventually you can back up into your home, or it's going to come out the top. And sometimes you see that an area near a septic tank or a septic field is really green. It tells you that it's not necessarily going down like it's supposed to. There's an issue, or it may just be wet. I know I had a homeowner a few years ago send me a picture of they had applied a bunch of sod the year before, and they could actually step on it and see a wave. The sod actually made a wave because there was a layer of water from their septic underneath it, keeping it from, adhering to the soil, if you will. It was really interesting, but it's also really not what you want. So for a to-do list for your septic system or your on-site system, just maintain the area around your tank and drain field. You need to be able to know where your inspection port is. So when we do that webinar every July on on-site systems, we get a number of questions in advance from people asking how they find their septic tank. And my suggestion to anyone who has a buried tank is to have that upgraded, if you will, or do some work on it so that you can have the inspection port and the maintenance port available. Some of them require it. If it's more advanced, you have to add things like chlorine, and so those for sure wouldn't be buried anyway, but and they're a different tank. Reduce the flow into your septic system. You don't have to be crazy about reducing the flow. It's a natural system, but if you're putting a lot of water through it, it doesn't give the microbes that are in the tank a chance to break down the material that you've sent there. So you shouldn't put sump pumps through it, whirlpools, softener backwash, any of those things. some of the softener backwash may have a lot of chlorine in it, chloride, and so it may not be best for those bacteria anyway. A septic tank works because the natural bacteria in our bodies can grow there and break down all the things we put in there, including, all the waste we have. One thing that shouldn't go in is a garbage disposal. When you chop up, if you have your tomatoes or your orange peels or whatever, your eggshells, whenever you put those down into and it gets into your septic system, there's no way for the bacteria to break those down in any kind of timely manner without building up and increasing the amount of sludge in the bottom. And it will fill up your tank. In fact, the rule of thumb that I've always been told is if you have a certain size tank and a certain number of people, that kind of dictates how often you need to have your tank pumped. And if you have a garbage disposal, you should cut that in half. Also, no man-made stuff, paint, pills, anything. A lot of people, I just heard at a talk yesterday from a chemist that he said, do you remember in the old days whenever you asked your doctor what to do with all the penicillin or amoxicillin you had left, what they told you to do? They told you to flush it down your toilet. And so now that's not the case. We know better. And so you shouldn't put any of those things down in your septic tank because they could either kill the bacteria or prevent them from doing their job. And it's just going to eventually cause problems for your tank. And if anything that's not supposed to be in there gets into your drain field and starts clogging up those perforated pipes, then you're looking at replacing the entire drain field. And that obviously would be very expensive. I mean, a drain field will eventually fail. They're not meant to last forever, but you should do what you can to make it last as long as you can. And that's obviously in your own best interests. So inspect the tank so you know where the solids are in the bottom. You can have a septic contractor come out and do that. They've got a tool that helps measure that. And if you've not ever, or it's been a long time since you've pumped your tank out, then you should have that done, have them measure the solids, and then come back in a year just to measure the solids. And you'll get an idea of how much that builds up and how quickly, so then you can make a better guess at when you should have your tank pumped to avoid any of those problems. Okay, so one of the best sources of information, two I'm going to show you. One is the EPA's website. This is epa.gov/septic. They have a huge program called Septic Smart. We participate. This year, it was in September. It's usually the third week of September, I think. And so this is a new slide, so they haven't updated their for when it's going to be in 25 yet, but we're a long way away. But there's a lot of information on here, and they do a lot of things working with organizations. They developed this decentralized partnership, and it includes groups like all the major organizations that support on-site systems, NAURA, RCAP, National Rural Water, I mean, you name it, National Association of Clean Water Agencies. There's a long list. You can find all that there. But it's getting all the organizations that have folks in the industry on the same page and understanding, giving a consistent message so that, we can help folks understand why they need to take care of their septic system and like this drain field shown here on a regular basis, and that improves water quality. It prevents overflows and contamination of aquifers, shallow aquifers, all those things. So if you go to their webpage and you click on Septic Smart Homeowners, you can get to some information, and then if you don't know much about your septic system, you can find more, especially how it can affect water quality. And so there's just, again, I'm going to go through this kind of fast. There's actually a ton of information available. This is a website you can peruse as you have time, and you can talk to your contractor about your specific tank if you don't know what kind of on-site system you have. Most are traditional with a septic tank in a drain field, but there's a ton of variations from that depending on where you live, what kind of geology you have. You know, for instance, the folks up in upstate New York, if they're on a lake that's bedrock at the surface, so they can't have a traditional drain field. And a lot of those are advanced systems that actually are like a small treatment plant, and they treat the water, all of it, and before it can be released, it has to meet certain water quality parameters, and then they have to have someone coming out regularly and take care of all that waste. And that's just the way it is given where they live. And so yeah, there's a picture here. I'm gonna go back. This one in yellow that shows septic systems and drinking water. So if you look at this, there's a diagram and a table, and it talks about what the risks are. But I remember I mentioned earlier that depending on the groundwater flow direction, even if your tank's on the other side of the house and your drain field, and it actually meets the code for setback distance, you know, in Illinois, I think it's 75 feet. Your well has to be away from your septic tank and drain field. But if it's all shallow enough and the soil is coarse enough that it can get to the aquifer fairly quickly, like in this example, it could be affecting the well. And so if you have a bacteria problem and you've shot chlorinated your well and you keep having coliform bacteria or E. coli problems, then it's, you know, what we tell people, and it's likely there's a local source, and it could be this situation, this very situation that's causing it. There's also a lot of information on advanced systems, and this is, you know, quite an industry and quite a, it's becoming more and more of a requirement for advanced technologies because states are trying to protect their groundwater and ecology and their river systems. And so there's a lot of information. If you have that kind of system, you can find unbiased information here. There's also a lot of webcasts that have been done based on different topics. You know, every year for Septic Smart Week, they ask some of the organizations that are a part of that MOU to either provide materials or work with them to find places to shoot video or whatever. And so there's a lot of good information out there. Yeah. So the other thing I want to mention is NAWRA, the National On-Site Wastewater Recycling Association. Last year, working with RCAP, they developed this on-site wastewater treatment system user's guide. It's for homeowners, and it's really, it's just a great document. That's all I'll say. I don't remember how many pages it is, but it's got everything in it, even about more advanced systems. It just really, they're trying to, even the terminology thing, different parts of the country, they use different terms. In some areas, they don't say septic at all. They just say on-site or decentralized. And so it's all, you know, it's meant to, this document alone will really help make things more consistent nationwide, which is what we see as our mission with private wells, is that we're giving consistent information to everyone. And so it's a really nice document. And so, you know, it just walks you through even troubleshooting, so that when you have a problem, if you have a more advanced system and it's got an alarm on it, you know, what to do with that, all that sort of stuff. So we're working with NAWRA through RCAP to develop an 11th lesson for our private well class. Right now in lesson 6, if you've taken the class, you remember seeing that seeing a picture of a septic tank in a drain field, and we spend about half a page talking about the very basics, like what you need to not do and why you shouldn't have trees over your drain field. Some of those very basic things, but we're going to develop a lesson. It's actually, Sally's already developed a draft for us to share with NAWRA. And eventually we'll have, when you sign up for the private well class, there's 11 lessons instead of 10. It's actually going to be lesson 6. That's where it fits in the whole flow of all that information, and all the ones like the current number 6 will be 7 and so on. But we're using NAWRA's guide, the user's guide, to develop that. And then NAWRA is actually going to edit it for us and make it consistent. And, you know, so this, like, I expect these 2 images to be in there. Yeah. Water quality, that's the other thing in testing. We recommend testing your well annually, anytime it's been opened, or any change in taste, odor, or color. And so annually is only for coliform bacteria, or coliform bacteria and nitrate, excuse me. And that's really not to say your water's safe to drink. You test for coliform and nitrate so that you're sure that there's no surface influences getting in your well. And so it's a simple, fairly cheap way to ensure that your well still has integrity. Your cap is still, there hasn't been a flooding event. Your teenage kid hasn't hit your PVC well with a riding mower and cracked it near the surface. All those things. And so, and I'll get into this more, but yeah, you want to be sure whenever you're drinking water safe. And as far as what to test for, it really depends on where you're at, how deep your well is and what aquifer it's in, or formation, geologic formation, and if there are any known contaminants in the area. And so the advice we give is, there's another slide here that'll provide a basic set of contaminants you should probably test for every 3 to 5 years. But otherwise, you need to be a little bit inquisitive. Talk to your county or local health department or your state health department. Talk to your water quality resource agency, like that may be a Department of Environmental Protection, it may be a DNR, it may be a Department of Environmental Quality. The people that map aquifers and water quality, that's what you need to find in your state. So they'll know if there are any natural contaminants, especially in an area. Like we know in Illinois where there are areas where it's higher likelihood of finding elevated arsenic or other things. We know there's this one small area in the state where there's high fluoride, which, most of the time you have no fluoride, you have to add it. But in some cases it could be too high. And if it's too high, that's also a health risk. And so you need to ask and find out because there can be all kinds of local contaminants you may not be aware of. And you also need to consider where you're at. Are you the home that's right next to a gas station with buried tanks? Is there a Superfund site, 2 miles down the road? Knowing which way the groundwater is flowing there really matters, because if it's flowing towards you, eventually that could be a problem. Is it, in a more industrial area? All those things matter. Are you applying chemicals? Are you storing them near the well? All those things should go into your consideration of what to test for. Even, for PFAS, which we hear about a lot. We just got a call from a homeowner who lives next to an airport. I think it was an Air Force base, and the Air Force tested their water and it was high in a particular PFAS chemical. And so now they're getting bottled water from the Air Force. But if there's a known source, that makes it easy to know you better test, or you should. And then again, testing for nitrate and coliform is really about your well integrity, not about saying your the water's safe to drink. And that's a real big misnomer, if you will. We hear a lot of people who call us and say, well, my county came out and tested for coliform and nitrate and they said my water's safe. They should be saying that their well is safe, and they still need to get a test for other things. They should test, again, for arsenic and some other things. And in their home, if it's an older home, lead, some of those things. So a couple examples. Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection has this website where most of the state and most of the private wells are in bedrock, except near the coast, I think. And if you, so they have commonly find arsenic and uranium in their bedrock. And so you can enter your address. It'll tell you if they already have data in that area that suggests you could have elevated arsenic or uranium, and then why you should go ahead and test for those. And if it says you're not at risk in this area, then you don't need to test for those. And including resources for the folks in Massachusetts on the right there. This is Rhode Island. It's only like 30 by 40 miles in size, and all the little dots were orchards where they used arsenic for pesticide until the early 60s or maybe late 50s. Now what they find is those areas, certainly the soil is contaminated with arsenic, and in some cases it's gotten into the groundwater there. The big splotch in the middle, that's about a third of the counties or half the counties in Rhode Island, is where there's natural occurring beryllium. And this is a great example for me to share with everyone around the country, because when I first saw this over 10 years ago, I didn't even know beryllium was a regulated contaminant, but it is because it has health effects and it does occur in nature. And so every community has to test for beryllium. I would not recommend that most well owners test for beryllium unless they know there's a potential source. So if someone from Rhode Island called me, I would probably tell them you should just test for beryllium to be safe. And you can look online and find out what the health effects are, or talk to your doctor. But anyway, it's a good example of why you just need to ask, because there may be something in your local area that most people would never even think of testing for, even arsenic. When we work with the states looking at drinking water treatment for small community water supplies and how many had arsenic, we asked that question. We had 40 states respond to a survey. 7 of those states came back and said, we don't really have arsenic in our state. It's just the natural geology is such that it just isn't there and it doesn't come up in the groundwater. And so, because it's fairly abundant in the Earth's crust, so you expect to find it in most geologic formations, or at least as you go through those formations vertically, but not everywhere. And so that's why you ask. I'd hope to update this slide. This is an old slide, and I know now there's data in every county, but this is Wisconsin. They have a viewer. Wisconsin DNR, Department of Natural Resources, is the primacy agency for public water supplies, non-community supplies, and private wells. So they are the regulator for drillers, well construction code, all those things. And when they collect water samples from private wells, they have a database of that information, and they provide it through this website. Not the individual data, I don't believe, unless that's changed, but you can look at either county or township or section and see. So if I was going to move to Green Bay and buy a house that was on a well, I can see there that those 3 red counties, one of those is near Green Bay, and it says that their arsenic for the average for the samples in the county is over 21, which the standard for public water supply is 10. And again, the difference is a community can't provide water to its customers that's over 10, period. So they have to treat for it centrally at their treatment plant. And when they put it out in a distribution system, it's below 10. Where a well owner, you're on your own. You could be drinking water with 20, 200. If you don't test, you don't know. Yeah, this site actually has been updated. And now when you scroll over a county, it gives you statistics, how many are over the standard, how many total samples they had. It's really worth taking a look at. And if anyone's from a state agency, I know I'm very envious of this particular website. I wish we had one just like it, because it's really helpful. And having things like arsenic don't mean you don't buy the house. There's ways to treat for arsenic, and hopefully the person you're buying from would actually have already tested and knows that and has been upfront, and maybe already has either some kind of filter treatment or RO treatment on the home for arsenic. But if not, our advice to homeowners people who are buying a home is don't sign until you've tested the water and know what you're getting yourself into. So, but again, for today's discussion, there is information out there in some states. You just have to look for it, and it can really help you understand what you need to test for beyond what I'm going to show you here in a second. Okay, so this is what we recommend. And again, remember, we're dealing with a national audience. We have people from many states on this webinar. And so giving advice like for beryllium doesn't make sense, which is why the last bullet there says get advice from your local and state health department. But a lot of common things, not only, some of them are nuisance, like iron, red staining. Manganese is also usually comes out if there's iron. A lot of times there's also manganese, and they're both considered secondary contaminants, which means they don't have health risk. They're there because they cause aesthetic problems like staining your clothes or staining your sink. But it's recently been learned that manganese does cause health effects. It causes neurological effects. And so I believe it's on the last candidate contaminant list, which is what EPA does in order to evaluate a chemical before they decide to make it a law that you have to treat for it. And so they're working on manganese. And we know that, as a homeowner, if you have manganese, I believe it's 300 milligrams a liter, but I would look online. Your state may have its own regulations for public water supplies, even though the federal government doesn't. But it's something to know, especially for kids. So the zinc and cadmium, or if you have galvanized pipes, if you have it's an older home, you may have lead pipes, you may have galvanized pipes, you may have copper pipes with lead solder. There's research that's shown that even just the solder, if the water sits there overnight and it's corrosive enough, it can cause enough lead to come out of that solder that it's it's a risk in your home. So, and some of these things are really just to give us a better, someone who understands, how turbidity or TDS or, pH matters. Because certainly alkalinity and pH matter for how corrosive your water might be. And so it's just what we think is best advice. If you're going to hand your water sample results to someone who knows how to evaluate water quality and what it might mean, whether you can have lead pipes and they don't leach at all if your water is of a certain quality. It's only when it's aggressive or a little bit corrosive that you start to see that leaching. And so knowing all those things matters. And that's, this is what we believe is best. Okay, so as far as where to get it analyzed, and I did not update this slide from April, but I meant to. So every state accredits labs in their state and many out of their state that are then allowed to do water quality testing for public water supplies. So if you think about every little community in your state, they have to test their water every 3 months under the Safe Drinking Water Act. They have to have a licensed water operator. All these rules to ensure that the water that's going to all the people that live in that town is safe. So try to use one of those labs because they've already done the work to show their state agency that they can reproduce results, that they're doing things using the right methods, all those things. You can find that. You can just look up, my state accredited water sample lab. You can contact us. That's a good source as well. But whenever you contact a lab, make sure they're giving you good instructions. They can explain what you need to do, whether they're going to ship you a sample or you're going to go pick it up. All those things that you shouldn't leave there without having all of your questions answered. And if they can't, I would find another lab. And I do want to mention that there are services out there that you can get online and order a kit. Just be careful. There's some that are really good. And matter of fact, one that we plan to partner with eventually to provide a place for people who don't know where to get a sample done, where they do ship you a kit. They give you a return label. They have instructions for how to collect it, and then it ships to a certified lab near you. We aren't there yet, but we are probably going to work with one particular company that we've evaluated and feel like they're on the up and up, so to speak. And most are, it's you just have to be careful, but that's why you use an accredited lab. That way, they've already been vetted basically by your state primacy agency that regulates drinking water rules. So, yeah, I think enough said there. As far as interpreting results, there are a number of websites out there that you could plug in your results and they'll tell you what's wrong or what's right, all that stuff. And also a lot of information on the internet, obviously documents about specific things, but you need to use those if you want to get a sense of what could be an issue, but you should always take it to your local or county or state health department and get a professional or your health professional, your doctor or a PA to get a qualified answer. If your arsenic is 25 and the standard is 10 parts per billion, then you need to talk to a health professional about what that risk means, and because that's not something we can do. We can only tell you that there's a line in the sand, and if it's 25, it's over it, and so that's not considered safe by the US EPA and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and so communities can't have their water that high. And we had that very thing happen here in Illinois. I did a bunch of work in a large aquifer in Illinois, put in monitoring wells, we're doing all this work. It turns out there's a fair amount of arsenic there. And some people were like, my dad lived to be 87 and he drank this water his whole life, and they're not even interested. They don't care. They think it's okay. But yeah, it doesn't mean they are. Everyone's susceptibility, that's all a health thing. And it's best just to make sure you're keeping your family safe. And if it's bacteria, you tested for coliform, then you should do an E. coli test. Coliform actually doesn't cause sickness. E. coli does, and some other bacteria. And so coliform bacteria is the most ubiquitous, if you will, most common thing you're going to find. If there's a way for bacteria to get in your well, there's likely going to be coliform there. And so that's why we test for it. But E. coli does cause health issues. People die from getting E. coli bacteria. And so if you've done a test for coliform, you want to go back and do an E. coli test. And while you're waiting for that test result, you should boil your drinking water. And you can also then chlorinate or shock chlorinate your well and retest once you know what's going on. So the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services developed this. Now it's been, oh boy, is it before 2017? So 2016 probably. They had funding from CDC to develop this Be Well Informed tool and guide. And it's meant for New Hampshire residents, but anyone can use it. And actually it was so popular after it was developed that they gave the code on this, what I'm going to show you in a second, to EPA, and then EPA, it's now with the Environmental Council of the states, and at least 8 or 9 states have signed on and have their own version. But everyone's sharing the code behind this, and it allows the states to each provide materials that are state specific, and it's just really cool. We should have all 50 states involved in this. But if you go in with your sample results and click on enter your well water test results at the bottom there, it takes you to a page where you can enter all your constituents that you've sampled for. So one of the things here is, like most labs, the standard reporting units might be milligrams per liter. Well, if your lab provides it in a different format and there isn't an option here to change the units to match what's on your piece of paper with your sample results, then it can mean a lot of different things. Like, 15 milligrams per liter is 15,000 micrograms per liter. So, putting 15 in there if it's under milligrams would raise a lot of alarms. I mean, 15 is over the limit, but it's barely over the limit. You can put anything you want, all the different constituents here, but you can click on a drop down and change the units. So when I do that, I get a red X, arsenic. 15 milligrams or micrograms per liter is 0.015 milligrams per liter, which is the standard reporting unit, which is higher than 0.01, which is what it says in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So you've went over a standard. Now it's also telling you what kind of media, what kind of treatment you could use. Point of use absorptive media or point of use reverse osmosis. So when you call a drinking water professional or a treatment specialist and you want to consider adding an RO unit or absorptive media filter unit, they shouldn't try to sell you anything else. Most will not, but you have some information that this is what I'm after. Here's, which of these would be better for me. They may want to come out and collect some more samples. That's a thing. There is a list of treatment professionals on the Water Quality Association's website. It's just wqa.org. You should always use equipment that's been certified by a third-party certifier, which there's a number of those. The Water Quality Association Gold Seal, the National Sanitation Foundation, and Underwriters Labs. For those of you that remember when light bulbs always had that UL stamp, and maybe some of them still do, that's Underwriters Labs have certified that these light bulbs actually do what it says on the label they're going to do. And the same thing here, you want someone, a third-party certifier, to confirm that if they say it'll remove it below 10, that it actually does. And so that's useful. And we talk a lot more about that in lesson 10 of our class, about how you can be protect yourself from having equipment that you don't need. Like if someone tries to sell you a, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I think I have a slide on this, so we'll just move on. Further down the list, then it also tells you more information about your treatment options, and it also has a little bit of health information there about what can happen if you drink arsenic, water with arsenic in it. So, and again, this is just a tool. There's sometimes really odd water. Like we ran across the groundwater in northern Illinois because it's near an old industrial site where the pH was 12 or 13, which doesn't happen in normal groundwater. And so that really messes with the chemistry and what kind of constituents might be in it. And so again, these tools are for typical groundwater and waters. You should always take your results to a health department or your health professional, like your doctor, and get their answer and qualified advice on what to do there. And if they can't help you, maybe they don't have all that experience, they'll know someone who does, and that's what you should ask. Who can you direct me to? But in the end, the health professionals, they, whether at a county health department or a local health district or in your doctor's office, they're all concerned about making sure your water is safe to drink. And this bottom bullet, they cannot tell you to stop drinking your water or condemn your well. They can only recommend it. That is not entirely true. There are a few local health districts in the Northeast part of the country where they actually have the authority to condemn a well. And so if you're concerned about that, my recommendation to you is to contact your local health department first, ask them what their well regulations are, as every local health district can create their own. And then if you're concerned about that, because my take on that is they're trying to protect your health, but it's quite a burden on a homeowner with a family if all of a sudden they find out tomorrow they have to stop using their well. And so, because many of these things are chronic issues, not acute, and you should have the opportunity to find out more information before you decide what your next steps are. So, yeah, and that's not to go counter to any health advice, because I totally respect what all the health departments do, but at the same time, yeah, a homeowner, I understand that just stopping using your well can be a real burden until you figure something out. Certainly for your drinking water, it's easy enough to use bottled water for a while, but for other things, to stop using your well totally is a burden. As far as treatment, you need to have a reason for treatment. And when I say that, I mean, don't add treatment just because it's like, oh, well, I'll just add this and I know my water's safer. You should test first and find out if there's really anything wrong with your water. Natural groundwater can be completely safe. And if it is, consider yourself fortunate. It's mineralized, it has good taste, and most times, and there's no reason to have that expense. The only time you should use treatment is whenever there's a health risk or there's cosmetic issues or secondary issues like staining, color, taste, odor. And so, yeah, don't assume, test, which is what I just said, I guess, and know what it does and doesn't treat. You can't add an RO unit and say, oh, it takes everything out, I don't need to do anything else, and not realize that there's other things. And you just need to understand how that all works. And again, there's two types of in-house treatment. There's point of use, which would be like a RO unit under your sink, reverse osmosis, that has its own tap, so you could use that for your baking or your cooking and drinking water, and a point of entry, a POE unit, which takes care of the whole house. Rarely for some things that aren't you're not already doing, would you need a whole house purification system. And so this is a long slide, but I want to talk about it because we've run into folks who are adding point of entry reverse osmosis because they have arsenic. And the only things that you should be using that are whole house would be like your softener or an iron filter, things that are, or an aerating filter for iron or manganese and some of those things so that you don't have that staining and some of those issues. You don't want any of your sinks to be stained. Then you put a filter on before it's distributed throughout your house. But RO, that's for arsenic, does not need to be whole house. It's a drinking water risk. It's not a dermal risk. It's not an inhalation risk unless it's at a huge level. And I asked, I'm not a health professional, so I asked the Minnesota Department of Health, and they said generally at levels found in groundwater, it won't cause any problem other than from drinking it. And so I know of a few people who have a whole house RO unit because the salesman sold them that, and it costs 10 times as much not only to buy but to maintain, and it creates a thing of wastewater that is difficult to deal with. It's concentrated, and it's really an unnecessary waste of money and water. And you just like any other person you're going to vet for, for a babysitter or for anything else, get references, find several to talk to, ask your state agency if they have folks who, like at your health department, that are in toxicology, or others. Even, there may be a good program, like, for instance, Virginia Tech has a program for the state of Virginia where they sample wells, and the person that runs that program would be a good source if you're in Virginia to ask about types of treatment based on what the results say. So you just have to figure out who those folks are, and a lot of times we can help you with that too. As far as maintenance, this is a huge issue. Most of these treatment devices, if you don't maintain them the way you're supposed to, and you don't change the filter when you're supposed to, they can become a source of contamination, especially bacteria. If it has a replacement schedule for stuff, stick to it. As an example, when we first started the private well class was in 2013, and Minnesota Department of Health had 8 people on who reviewed the original class lessons that we put together. And one of them said, if I were you, I wouldn't ever talk about treatment. And what I find in the field is that when I go to a home and they have a bacteria problem or some other problem, it's likely to be a treatment device that's not been maintained and has bacteria growing in it, as it is, a natural problem. So if you're gonna do treatment, you have to follow the replacement schedule and the maintenance schedule. If you don't, you're opening yourself up to other problems. There's a lot of different types of treatment for a lot of different things. It's worth the effort to know that you're not actually creating a new problem. And that's going to come up in one of the questions today, actually, So the next section here, I want to talk about the private well class a little bit. In our program, again, it's been around since 2013. It's 10 lessons. It's a PDF. We email them to you once a week over 10 weeks. You sign up at 6 o'clock in the morning, you'll get an email at 6 o'clock every Friday morning, for instance, if that's when you signed up. It's all self-paced. You're on your own to read it. But the material's there. It's yours. It's all free. What I try to encourage well owners to do is, if you take the private well class first, then when you come to these webinars or when you have questions, you're gonna have much better questions that are related to your issues, not a general question like, what should I sample for? It's all in there, and I brought it up today. That's what this webinar is about, but the lessons cover all of that, including more information on treatment and common problems. And we're going to have one just on septic and on-site systems here fairly soon. So I encourage you, if you've not signed up for the class, to go to privatewellclass.org and sign up, and I'll show you a picture of that. This is what our front page looks like. There's a green button to visit our help center, which is what Sally and Aaron run, and also a button to take our free class. And that's what I encourage you to do. It's that simple. You sign up with an email address, your first name, and where do you live. It's a drop down for which state you're in. And the only reason we ask that is because we're trying to show the folks that fund us that we have a national program We do. We have a lot of people from all 50 states who've taken our class, as well as many other countries. But that's how we track that. It's really bean counting, so that we can justify the funding they give us. And so you can enroll. I said when you click on enroll, you'll get a pre-test, which is like 7 or 8 questions, so we can gauge how much you learned over the time of taking the lessons. And there'll be a post-test at the end. It's on a website. You don't have to send anything or write anything, and that helps us as well. The class is available in Spanish. If you are with a local health district or a county health department that may have a significant native Spanish-speaking population who are on private wells, then this is available. It doesn't get a lot of traffic, but it does get some, and it's worth it to have folks go through that for sure. For each lesson, there's also a set of resources available. I know someone asked, what can I read to prepare for this webinar? Well, I'm going to answer that at the end, because first thing is a private well class, and the second thing is all these additional resources are here if you want. If the lesson is only 6 to 10 pages long, and if that doesn't resonate with you, it's written in a way that's more like it's a conversation, then one of these other documents will provide a different perspective, not different answers. They all agree. In fact, some of these were used to provide some of the pictures or images that are in there, but it's just written in a different style. And there's a lot more detailed information. Some of these documents are pretty big. We do webinars like today every month, and we did one on outreach strategies on June 8th in 23. That webinar was specifically for professionals like at a health department or extension office or anyone else who's trying to do outreach to get well owners more engaged with their well. Sorry, I had to take a drink, but it's there and it's available. I think we're up to in the 120s of our total webinars we've done over the last 10 years or so. And again, the back half of all of those are questions that people asked who are attending. We did this also in 23 on funding and financing. We haven't done this again because this is available online. And some of the funding, there's not a lot of funding available. But since we've done this webinar, we know that USDA is one of the big funders for low-income folks. There's a program where they provide money to nonprofits who can loan money to well owners if they meet a certain economic criteria. It's a 1% loan over 20 years, which is a great deal. But if you don't qualify for that, you're really on your own, and that's most well owners. There's a new program from the National Groundwater Association called Water Well Wish. It's a small program. They can't do hundreds of wells, but they're making a dent, and they work with folks who maybe are above the level required for the USDA funding, but just barely over it. And so because they can't get USDA funding, they come in and help. It's the Water System Council has a program too. I struggle with that name. Aaron, Sally, Katie, what's the program for providing wells? Anybody remember? Okay, I'm gonna move on. Anyway, the Farm Bill's, this is all funded through the Farm Bill to USDA, and that's being finalized now. I'm not sure when it's supposed to be released. I'm assuming before January 15th, but I don't know that. I'm not a big little guy, if you will. But we know there's going to be changes to the USDA program when that happens. And so we're going to wait until those changes are actually implemented and then ask the folks at USDA to come back, and they participated in this webinar with us so they could share relevant information, and we'll ask them to do that again. We know the proposed bill has information about allowing people who've tested and have a known contaminant to use some of those funds for adding treatment, which would be a great thing because that's the issue, right? Even if you found some way to get your water sampled fairly cheap or free, what happens when they find something? Now you've got to add treatment, and that can be expensive. And so we're hopeful that that program is going to be more robust and include that. And we'll do a webinar on it as soon as we can, once we know. The last time we did this was in 18, because nothing's changed. We know about lead. We know what it's a risk. The safe drinking water level for anybody, especially kids, is really 0. You should have no lead in your water. It's not safe at any level. So we had an expert from Virginia Tech on this webinar who talked about some of the things she's found. She's now at Northeastern University, Kelsey Piper. And so we put materials together that explain, lead isn't a public water supply issue. All the money that's floating around now to replace lead service lines for distribution systems for communities doesn't affect whether you have lead in your home because of lead pipes or copper pipes with lead solder or galvanized pipes, or there's a number of other variations. So once all those lead service lines replaced, even for homes in a community, if it's an older home that's got lead pipes, they're still at risk of having lead exposure in their drinking water. And as a homeowner of a private well, this is really about your plumbing system in your house, not about all that other stuff. Because if you have any kind of lead in your system, again, any of those types of pipe, then understanding your water quality is critical to knowing whether anything's being leached. And the quickest way to understand that is to collect a sample and see if there's an issue. So we created this page that provides information on water filters. They do a great job removing lead and other things. It's just privatewellclass.org/lead. We also have a series of videos like this one on what should I know about a shared well. There are a lot of folks who share a well out there around the country. A lot of times it leads to disagreements, or you have 4 or 5 homes on the well and there's no written agreement or nothing in the deeds or the contracts for the property, and the pump fails. Now, everyone's got to agree they're going to split that $5,000 cost among the 5 homes, and you have one neighbor who says, I can't do that. It leads to a lot of problems. And so there's a lot of information to know about those things. And as far as your septic tank, your pressure tank, what we've learned from having these videos, how to keep my well from losing pressure, and also how does my septic on the brain. My pressure tank, how does my pressure tank work? By far the most commonly accessed video we have. And so I think it's nearing 500,000 views, if I remember right. We also started a podcast. It's just drinkingwaterpodcast.org. It's called the Drinking Water in Rural America podcast. We have guests on that are private well experts. Dr. Wolf is actually the head of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital, but he deals with cases where odd cases in children that sometimes involve well water. Brian Swistock is retired now, but he was at Penn State, and in his time there built an amazing outreach and education program. He was a big loss to our industry when he decided to retire, but he left quite a legacy of information. So if you're interested in podcasts, they're all actually usually national experts. We try to get people who are actually making a difference, some of those things. So our hotline and help center, that other button on our front page, as I mentioned, Sally Dolan and Aaron Huggett manage this. If you try to call us, one of them is likely to answer. It's operated during work hours, but it's a lot more than a phone number. We've also input all the material that we've written, like our class material, our webinar transcripts. And if you use the chat feature, it actually creates an answer based on all of that database material. There's also what's called a knowledge base, which is basically a set of articles. Each article, the title is a question, and the meat of the article is an answer to that question. And it covers all the basic information, even some we're going to talk about today, about like what to do. I'm going to use flooding as an example here in a second. It's really been well accepted. It's we went about it, I think, the right way, and so it covers a lot of bases. And what we've learned from that is we're not getting all these phone calls from people who have a really basic question. They're finding it in the knowledge base, or they're finding it using the chatbot. But if they have a really unique or more complex issue, like what to do about my galvanized pipe that I just replaced in my drop pipe from my well, because galvanized pipe has to season, and so the chemistry changes in, say, the first year of a galvanized pipe. Things that are really out there, or my sampling results indicate there's this really weird thing in my well. Those are the questions we're answering now through phone calls. So it's interesting. It's also more time consuming, but we're helping a lot of folks. And if you haven't tried that out, the next time you have a question, go visit the Help Center and give it a spin. So for an example, here's what this page looks like. The phone number is at the top. You can search the articles, or you can ask the chatbot a question. For brevity, I'm just going to say, hey, we just had all these issues with Hurricane Helene. If I just type in the word flood, it comes up with all the articles that deal with that issue. And as you type more, it'll put the ones that have the most keywords that match at the top. And so, when you click on that top one, oh, I took that out, I'm sorry. It goes to a post we have, a blog post that links to a video on what to do after a flood. In the end, this is what we're trying to do. It's about trying to help well owners become aware. You need to understand what's on your well log, where's your water coming from, the depth of the pump, the depth of the well, do you have a screen or not, what's the geology look like, as well as then if there are any natural occurring contaminants, what you need to be concerned about in your area or in your aquifer. And then it'll help you ask better questions and learn the right questions to ask. And it'll also help you identify where you can get local sources of information. Because in the end, I've made a lot of contacts over the years with folks in every state, to be honest. But it's still better once you understand that you've got somebody locally who you can count on to answer questions for you. That's where you want to be. And so that's where we're trying to get everyone to, really. And last thing is sample your well. It's the number we've used since day one is 2/3 of well owners haven't tested their well. That's probably high now, but it's still well over 50% that have never tested their well. And so it's something you just need to do for peace of mind, nothing else. Oh, somehow those got out of order. This is what when you click on the first article, I apologize. You get this article, and it's the transcript from that video, which is one of those videos like the shared well video. It's just providing guidance on what you should do, especially after a flood. And as a team, our goal really is these things. It's to help well owners, to give them the target information they need so that they understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and what things they can do to help protect themselves from risk. So with that, we're going to go to the questions. I want to mention that this is where we answer the questions that we received from you all when you signed up for the class. If it was in the last few days, it's probably not here because we get a lot of questions. We can't answer all of them. We try to answer as many as we can, but if we may not get to yours. If we haven't already answered it and you really want an answer, as I mentioned earlier, Katie's monitoring the chat and question box on your GoToWebinar window, and you can type in a question there. She's making a list of those, and I'll pull that up on screen at the end. We'll share Google Docs. She types them in, I pull it up on my screen, and we can answer your questions. And if we can't answer it, we'll just let you know that and suggest an alternative. Okay, so local municipality water departments have a long list of substances they test for. What should it be on a homeowner's list of substances, which we've already talked about, and should it match what a municipality tests for? So I just wanted to talk about that because, we did recommend already what you should test for, but it's also dependent on where you live, what aquifer you're getting water from, and also well construction. If you have an old dug well, obviously you need to be worried about anything that's been used around the well, as well as bacteria and some of those things. also what kind of pipes you have in your home, if you're using treatment, all that stuff matters. So you would never test for everything on a community water supply list. They have a long list they're required to test for, and even they don't have to test for those all the time. Like if you're in one of those states I mentioned where they don't really have arsenic in their groundwater, after testing for like 2 or 3 years, you can request a variance so that you only have to sample maybe every 6 months or only once a year, and you do that for a few years. And then if you still show that as long as you keep the same water source, you're not going to have arsenic, then they'll remove that from your particular community's list so that you don't have to waste money testing for something that you're never going to find. So that's how the federal program works for community water supplies. Again, none of that matters for a private well owner. I mean, you're not required to test at all. And nothing's going to happen if you don't, but we're trying to make sure that you understand why it's really important that you do. Okay. Is UV treatment worthwhile if I haven't had any contamination issues? So as I've already mentioned, we only suggest you add any kind of treatment when it's necessary, and necessary being when testing finds that there's a problem and you have a contaminant. And as far as UV, UV is really for bacterial inactivation and virus too, I guess, and some other things, but it does nothing for other things like arsenic. I use that as an example. I use arsenic as an example a lot because I spent probably 10 years researching arsenic in groundwater in Illinois. And so it's something that I know a little bit about, not nearly as much as I probably should, but I know how it works and when you're going to find it and what form it's in and those things. So, but really the type of treatment depends on what you find from testing. And so that would dictate whether you have UV or RO, whether you need anything. You may have really high iron. There's systems that can be built to remove all that, but we run into cases where there's so much iron that it actually clogs the pipes, and stops water flow. So every situation again is a little different. So interested in a written procedure to shock our well. Okay, so there are literally hundreds of documents out there, from anything from a local health department to an extension office to a state agency to a lab, that all list a procedure for shocking your well, which shocking means shock chlorination. And you do this to disinfect your well when you've had a sample that shows you have bacteria in your well, coliform or E. coli or maybe something else. You should only disinfect when it needs it, for one. We've certainly had people say, well, I shock mine once a year. Well, that's a bad idea. You don't need to do it. Depending on the type of aquifer you have, if you have a bedrock aquifer, adding chlorine that high, it's an oxidant. It'll release metals into the water. And so unbeknownst to you, you may have just increased the amount of metals, some of those like arsenic or other things that are bad for you. So after looking at, I didn't look at several hundred, I probably looked at 50 or more documents that were about how to disinfect your well using chlorine. This is what I consider the best one. And if you remember back on earlier, I showed you that for each lesson, there's a set of resources and other documents you can look at to read. Under lesson 10, it's called Water Treatment Solutions, we link to this, and that's where I would go to get that. They've come up with newer versions of this, and this one's a little older, but it's more thorough. And in my opinion, I'd rather you have a 10-page document that covers everything than a 4-page one, because people think, because they figured that everyone won't read a 10-page document. If you want to shock chlorinate your well, you want to go through all the procedure you can. So it gives great advice, like how to mix up the chlorine. If you mix it too strong, or if you try to pour straight bleach down your well, you're really going to cause a problem. It won't necessarily be enough to take care of your problem. And it's harmful to well components. I mentioned it's an oxidant. So if you have brass fittings on your pump, metals get released into the water. So this is the document I recommend. It goes through things like how to mix it up so it's at the right concentration. 5% or 6% chlorine is way too strong. And so you need to know some information about your well to do that. But you can ask someone to help you with, like, you could, if you know how deep your well is, for instance, you could have a contractor come out and measure the depth, or you could try to do that if you, talk to your resource agency, your groundwater resource agency about that. But it also even tells you what to do about your treatment devices, what things can go through shock chlorination, what things can't. And just for the simple procedure, you mix chlorine up in a bucket and you pour as much as you need in the well based on that table. So then you have a hose from an outside spigot that you put back in the well where you've taken the well cap off, and you turn it on, and that circulates the water until it's all well mixed at the same concentration. And then once that's done for a while, shut it off, and then you go turn on every faucet, every shower, flush every toilet until you smell chlorine. And then you do that right at the end of the evening, and then you go to bed and let it sit overnight. And the chlorine's in the water. In theory, it's killing any bacteria that are in any of your lines. That's why you got to do every pipe in your home. And then the next day, you flush it all out until there's no more chlorine smell. And your water will go back to normal. In theory, if the bacteria were in the well or in your plumbing system, you've killed it. Sometimes that might take more than one time. Sometimes it won't be effective, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that's the standard approach. And if you don't do all those things, like I had a well owner up in Northern Illinois tell me that their contractor told them just to pour a cup of bleach down their well once a month, and they wouldn't have any problems. That does absolutely nothing to prevent bacteria growth in your well or your plumbing system. Nothing. So you shock chlorinated your well, then you retest it and you still have bacteria. So there's a number of reasons why that could be. One, it could be that there's biofilm in some of the lines, and you may have killed the top layer, but there might be a couple other layers there. You should try again. That's the cheapest solution, is to chlorinate it again, shock chlorinate it again. The others get more expensive. You might have a continuous source. I showed that diagram from EPA that showed where the septic system stuff's running from the drain field down into the aquifer, and then the well's picking it up. If that's the case, that's just bad luck. Your choices are to remove your drain field, drill a different well into a deeper aquifer, or add treatment, which is the most likely scenario there. But sometimes it can be other things. Chlorine only works when the pH of the water is below about 7.5, I believe. And so we know that when the pH of the water is above 8, it's just not as effective as a disinfectant, and it doesn't work. It won't kill anything. And so there was some research going on at Virginia Tech. I'm not sure where that's at today, but we do know that one thing that is starting to take hold, if you will, is that you can mix white vinegar to lower the pH. I have never said that on a webinar before because I don't know enough about it, but it seems I've seen it more and more in places, especially out east. And so we'll look into that more. But if your water has got a high pH, you can add vinegar while you're doing the disinfection, and that'll lower the pH, because even adding chlorine raises the pH. And so it's tough if your water chemistry is already at a high pH to lower it enough to actually make the chlorine effective at killing bacteria. And so the other thing could be that there's more bacteria than you think, and the chlorine you added wasn't enough. So whenever you turn on your taps, you never get to where there's a smell of chlorine. And that could be that the chlorine's already being used up, because to kill bacteria, you're using the chlorine. So if it has to do too much work, if you will, it may not make it to the end of the line. And so that's, in those cases, we recommend probably adding to the dose, going from 300 to maybe 400 parts per million or whatever. But yeah, these are all cases that aren't necessarily that normal, but they all certainly do happen. And so you just need to be aware. Okay, never had this question before. Didn't know what this bacteria is. I'm going to try to name it, but recently they found this bacteria, Pantoia agglomeraans. probably halfway close. In a new line, I'm assuming a new water line. So they're asking, is it harmful, and does this tap need to be put in? Does a new tap need to be put in? So I'd never heard of this bacteria, but what I've learned is it's like E. coli. It's the same class of bacteria, and it is also found in human and animal species like E. coli is. So I would treat it the same way. It's a threat. It can cause health effects. Well, actually, I looked up on the National Institutes of Health's website, and it does have health effects. And so it can cause a number of things. I'm not a doctor, or a health professional, and so I encourage you to talk to your doctor about those things. But like E. coli, your first step should be to evaluate your well and determine if, one, your well is protective of the surface, or if you have a continuous source. Because even then, shock chlorinating, again, isn't going to help, because it's just going to come back. And so you need to, but if it is, then I would shock chlorinate using the procedure I just talked about. And then, and I would try a couple times, but if it still comes back, I'm interested to learn where you had this testing done that they found this, because I don't think it's a common water test at all. I've never heard of it, to be honest, and I found that surprising after what I read on it. So again, you should talk to your doctor about any risks. So I have an Impression Plus air filter, and we certainly don't recommend any particular brand. So just wanted to say that, but it apparently works pretty well for hydrogen sulfide, which is that rotten egg smell that you get in your home sometimes when people, and so you want to know how it works. So I've written that here. So it's air injection. There's a number of ways to oxidize hydrogen sulfide. One of those is air. One of them's using media. You can find a laundry list of approaches, but this one injects air, and that helps oxidize the hydrogen sulfide. And then what that does is it forms a solid that falls out, if you will. So it's the same thing you do with iron, like an iron filter. You add chlorine. Chlorine's an oxidant. It causes the iron to fall out and form iron oxide, which is the red stuff. But if you do that before it comes in your home, or where it first comes in your home, then you're saving all your lines and all your porcelain from getting red, right? So, so this system is twofold. It bubbles air, and that helps oxidize the H2S, and it's got a, basically storage for that, where all the H2S that's still coming out on its own in solution doesn't go into your line and get into your home. And then it also has a filter media, which is one of the other ways that you treat for hydrogen sulfide. So it's a sand or a mineral, geologic mineral-based media that then they coat it with things like potassium permanganate is something that's used to, it's used in water treatment. One of the things it does is it helps prevent corrosion of pipes. It lowers the pH, or it raises the pH, and helps prevent like lead leaching. So that's coated on this media, and it reacts with the hydrogen sulfide. And then as it's slowly used up, you have to regenerate it. So they run it backwards, basically, to flush out all the media, and then it gets coated again. And they have their own proprietary stuff. I looked on their webpage, but then all the sulfur solids, when they back flush, are discharged out, and it releases all the air through either a vent or some kind of discharge, so that it gets rid of all the H2S. And I know your message also said that you haven't had any problems in 2 years. The system should work. The one thing I saw on their website was that in these type of systems, that media can grow bacteria. And so you either should have, it should be built into your unit, or there should be recommended procedure with the material you got, and whoever sold it to you should have also explained that to you, that you have to regularly disinfect that media, or you could have bacteria growth in there. And that's just a different problem, right? So, and that can happen to a lot of things, even softeners. If they're not back flushed like they should be, they can have things like E. coli or other bacteria. So annual testing. For a private well that suffers no catastrophic event, is annual testing really needed? I hadn't tested my well for 30 years. I finally tested it this year. It's fine. Well, one thing I forgot to put in here is that what all did you test it for? If you want to share that in an email, that'd be great. Because if it's just for coliform nitrate, which is what we recommend annually, it really isn't about your well being safe. And I've already talked about that. But this diagram shows you, I want to show two things here. One, this is, there's a water table and a shallow aquifer, and you can see it says days before it discharges into the river. If it makes it through that confining layer, which is a clay, and gets to a next aquifer, it can be years or decades before it eventually goes back to that river. It's all based on pressure. So if the water pressure is higher to the left, it's going to push water to the right. And that eventually the discharge point is the river. That's where the lowest spot is. All the water is going to come up through and end up in that river. But if it happens to make through it the next layer and gets down further, you can see those flow lines are centuries or millennia. We've age dated groundwater in the aquifer that I've done a lot of work in that has arsenic. In some areas, it's over 50,000 years old, but it'll eventually come back to the surface. So the point there is, do you know which one of those aquifers you're in? Is it the one that's going to take days for something from the surface to get over into the aquifer? Or is it years or decades? And so this is my point. I mentioned this earlier, that there would be a contamination one. And I say this, and this slide means a lot to me because I grew up on a farm. My dad and my grandpa used to use a bulldozer to dig a big hole, and they'd throw everything under the sun in it, including barrels. And so it's not right. I was a kid. But this is what happens when people do that. So you may think you're up over the hill and it's no big deal, but if that contaminant gets down in an aquifer, it's going to head right toward your well. See that little dip where the well is in the water table line? That's what the dash line is. That's where the saturated water line is. That dip is there because when you pump a well, you lower the water level in the well, and that has water then starts flowing right towards it. So it's like a sink, right? Whenever you pull the plug on your bathtub, all the water runs down the plug where the plug was. Same thing with the well. When you start pumping it, because you've lowered the water level, all the water runs right toward the well to try to fill it back in. So if you're in one of those deep aquifers where it's 50,000 years before it's going to make it to well your surface, you're fine not doing that. We find in those deeper aquifers, water doesn't change much, the chemistry. But if you're not, and for a lot of people, this shallow source may not have been there 5 years ago, and it is today. And so that's why you need to test. Off-the-shelf tests. So, and these are just two examples I pulled off of Lowe's website. There's no endorsement here. Matter of fact, I don't endorse any of these. So how to test the water quickly using off-the-shelf devices. There are really only a few things that can be reliably tested with accuracy, like pH, alkalinity. There's some kits for that because of pools, right? But there are no kits out there that are as accurate or comprehensive that can test for everything you need to test for, like a lab can. And they're also known to have more. A false positive means it says it's positive and it's not. A false negative means it says it's not positive and it actually should have been. And that's my biggest concern, is that you buy a little $20 kit, you take the test, it says there's nothing there, and you assume it's all safe, when that very well may not be the case. These things have shelf lives. There's a lot of reasons why it's not better to use these kits. You get what you pay for, and I would always recommend that you use a certified lab when it comes to your health and your family's health. So these two questions are about the private well class lessons. And one was, any books you recommend about reading? So yes, the private well class, do that first. And then the second question was, my request is for a checklist of sorts to provide private well owners regarding routine maintenance. That's also in our private well class lessons. This is lesson 5 under best practices. There's a series of 8 to 10 things that we recommend everyone do. And take our class. That's really the thing to do. It's free. It comes to you as a PDF to your inbox. and it'll answer a lot of these questions for you that, we can't answer every question about things that are in the private well class lessons on every webinar because there just isn't time. I'm already at at my 2 hours here. And so I just want to mention, if you haven't signed up for the class, even just for reference material, there's a lot of good information here. And they're yours to keep, right? We don't charge for them. They are copyrighted. We wrote them, but we want people to use them. So that's the message there. Last question. Are Sandpoint wells still used and allowed? So it depends on the state, but a number of states like Illinois no longer allow them. And we don't recommend anyone install a Sandpoint or dig their own large diameter well. Put in a bored well if you have to have a large diameter well so it's constructed properly. In Illinois, it used to be that people could put it in wherever they wanted. And they, especially in areas along rivers where there's a lot of sand, they would put in a Sandpoint. They're dangerous. They have no grout. Many times they're less than 20 feet deep, and they're in sandy areas where everything that goes on the ground ends up in the ground because of rainfall pushing it through. So they're not safe, and we certainly don't recommend using them. And there are still states that allow them, but in Illinois now, they changed the law that says you can still put in your own well, but you have to put in a well that meets our construction code, and these do not. So we'll go to the questions real quick. It's already 3. Pull that over, make it full screen. My well digger installed a frost-free hydrant just next to the well. What is the problem here? There isn't one. I don't believe I said that's a problem. The frost-free hydrant means it's got a backflow device that keeps it from the water in the column on your hydrant from freezing. So that's a kind of a different animal. And so it basically drains itself is what those do. And that way, if you're in a cold climate, you don't have to worry about, your pipe or your hydrant head busting because there's water in there that freezes. Hopefully that answers your question. Aren't toilet wipes bad for septics? Yeah. Toilet paper is fine for septics, but toilet wipes, or those wipes they say safe for septic, they aren't. And now is actually on a campaign to get states to legislate that you can't have that wording on there anymore. And I know one of their leads told us just a couple weeks ago that they've got several companies to voluntarily take that off. And I know if you go either, I think on our webpage, maybe in our newsletter, if you're a professional, we have a newsletter for professionals. We actually showed a video that someone else had posted on YouTube about those wipes and how toilet paper breaks down versus, and it shows it in a clear container. And they did some agitation to see how it breaks down, and they just do not. So do not, even if it says safe for septics, you'll end up pumping your tank a lot sooner and maybe clogging something up. If it gets, the outflow pipe has a filter on it, and if it gets stuck across that, you could be have trouble. It's the bottom line. So what testing schedule is recommended for a well used only for irrigation? I don't know that you need to test it unless you're worried about something that's at a level that's going to affect your plants. And I think, testing once and understanding, like for arsenic, you don't want to be feeding your vegetables water with arsenic in it. It's going to uptake it, right? It's like rice. Rice is very high in arsenic a lot of times. So some depends on the plants, but unless there's a reason, for your garden, it's a matter of, I might test once to make sure it's safe, but it's, not as much, I don't think it's as much of a risk at all. Okay, how many states require concrete well pads at wellhead? And what is a common size well pad for small individual wells, 4-inch casing and smaller? That's a state specific question. And as much as I wish I had that kind of knowledge, I don't. You need to, I don't know. I know the Water Systems Council puts out a document every couple of years, every 3 years maybe, on what the state regs are. And I would say if you go to their website and look for that, state regulations and rules, you might find that summarized there. But, you know, just like the 4-inch casing, that just jogged my memory. In Mississippi, if a well, I believe, is less than 5 inches in diameter, they don't have to file a log. And so you have a ton of 4-inch wells in Mississippi because then the drillers don't have to file a log with the state. You know, it's just every state's got different rules. And so it's, and there's no way to keep up with all of that. But that would be my advice. As far as summarizing that, that's not something we can do, but that one document may provide that for you. So, all right, well, thank you. We went a few minutes over. I appreciate everyone who stuck around. And if you have any other questions, there's our email address, info@privatewellclass.org. And yeah, that's where we're at. So thank you again. And I hope everyone has a great holiday next week.